Well, hi there, Rob. Good to catch up with you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Dave, you okay?
I'm very good, thank you. Yes, yes. I'm in my orange mood tonight.
You're very orange. Yes, that's good to see. Yeah, bright and happy.
Well, right, happyish.
Bright and quite shiny. Yeah, so it's good. Yeah, it's good to see
Oh,
you.
I've got a light just right above me, so
That's good.
it's an illusion. So we're chatting about last Sunday, and last Sunday we were continuing with Joshua. We reached chapter
Yeah.
2, and the amazing story of Rahab or Rahab. We weren't too sure how to pronounce her, were we?
That's
Should we
right.
decide right at the beginning? Is she Rahab or Rahab or Rahab?
Well, it's one of the famous characters of the Bible, and it's difficult to know really because we suspect that the chances are that she was a temple prostitute, and chances are that she would have been worshipper of a number of different gods, and one of those would have been the Egyptian god Ra. So the chances are that her name derives from that role that she had, if you like, within the temple. And she was an Amorite, and they were involved in some pretty dark practices. I mean, they're referred to in Genesis 15, but Amorites not only were pagans, and they worshipped a number of other gods, but also they sacrificed their children, and that was unfortunately one of the common practices of temple prostitutes, that the children they bore were sacrificed. So you've got a lady here who's actually in a very, very dark place, and been in a very, very dark place, and yet God reaches down and rescues her, and it's an amazing story. The Rahab and the spies, and she becomes one of the great pillars of faith within the Bible, referred to in Hebrews 11. Yeah.
Yeah. It is amazing, isn't it? If you like, kind of the headlines that she gets. I mean, obviously, she's part of the Jewish story and the conquest of Canaan. Uh, and you'd almost think, well, she'd have been forgotten, but she gets picked up in the New Testament, doesn't she? In two amazing ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so she's also part of the genealogy of Jesus, and she's a matriarchal genealogy, and later, of course, in the matriarchal line, Boaz is born, and of course we know that he marries Ruth, and therefore she's part of that sort of salvation history, and also she's referred to in Hebrews 2 as well, not Hebrews chapter 2, but Hebrews as well, and as one of the sort of last people that's cited actually. As one of the great sort of heroes of faith. So Rahab is a great character of faith. Jewish tradition has that she marries Joshua himself. That's not actually the case. She married somebody called Salmon, and she becomes part of the Jewish nation and the Israelite nation, and a follower and believer of Yahweh. So it's a great story of redemption.
Yeah. And I guess we can look at Rahab, but it's probably more important that we look at God to start with, isn't it? Because it reveals so much about who God is, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that that's one of the wonderful things about the story of Rahab is that the Lord has a purpose and a plan for our lives, and He clearly had a purpose and a plan for Rahab's life. And even though she was in one of the darkest places, He was able to sort of reach in and rescue her. And already she had heard the stories of how God had rescued the Israelites, and how He had got the Israelites over the water and out of the clutches of the Egyptians. And she was also aware of the victories that they had against the Amalekites. And so Rahab had heard the stories of God and of His power and His faithfulness to the children of Israel, and she had become a believer. And in that, she sort of makes this statement of faith quite early on to the spies to say, "I know that your God has already taken this land. He's already given the land to the children of Israel." So she's in this position of faith. and she takes the spies, and it's difficult to know quite what the circumstances are. I think theologians probably think that what she's got going there is probably an inn, so that it's not just a house of disrepute, but it's also an inn. And so, but it would have been a perfect place for spies to have come, because there'd be lots of toings and froings and lots of strangers accessing the building. But she seems to be also somebody who spun and wove flax as well. So she's a clothes maker, because of course she hides the spies. Once the king gets news of this, she hides the spies on her roof under the flax stalks as well. So she's a lady of resource. She's got a number of businesses going on. Whether she was still a temple prostitute at that stage, was difficult to say. But one thing we do know for certain about Rahab is that she was a believer, and a genuine believer in Yahweh.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, whether or not she was kind of active at that time, it's recorded in the story of Joshua. And, when Matthew writes his genealogy and when Hebrews is written, they don't admit it. So it's not something that kind of they're ashamed of in terms of the choices that God makes. That,
No.
they're quite willing, if you like. I'm not saying it's a badge of honor to wear, but,
It's just
she's still referred to as sort of Rahab the prostitute or Rahab the harlot, kind of.
yeah, because I mean, obviously God reaches down and rescues her from that situation. And in fact, interestingly enough, if you look through scripture, you'll often find many of the characters in the Bible, Moses himself, of course, somebody who had killed somebody. I mean, here's somebody who not many of the great patriarchs, not many of the great characters of the Bible. David sort of stands up as a classic example of this as well. Adulterer and murderer are people that have necessarily been sort of beyond repute. They are people that God has used and has rescued in those situations, and Rahab is part of that story too, and so I think it's a wonderful reminder as to how powerful God is at reaching into people's lives and redeeming them and rescuing them.
Yeah. Also, just referring back to the genealogy in Matthew, it's as if Jesus is not ashamed to have his name, if you like, kind of at the bottom of that list. With Rahab there mentioned as the harlot, and also no reason to include this. It says, David, who married Uriah's wife. So if you like, almost deliberately putting in, probably the worst thing that David did as the greatest thing.
Yeah.
And Jesus is quite happy then having his name at the bottom of that list, saying, well, this is the line I came from. Priests and kings are fallen people.
They're all fallen, and we've all fallen, and none of them were pure and righteous in that sense. But God is a powerful redeemer, and he can redeem us and he can restore us. And I love the story by Bobby Connor, and I don't know if you've ever heard that story of when he was taking a service in Texas, and a group of Satanists came, and when they came into the building, they were clearly impacted by the presence of God in that building. But what was really interesting in that time was that Bobby Connor had a word of knowledge from the Holy Spirit. And as they were leaving, he called out for one of the girls and said, "Karen, you shouldn't be in this group. You should be with us." And I think a couple of days later, the girl called Karen came back, and eventually she gave her life to Christ. And that's, again, just an example of how powerful God is at reaching in and redeeming people, even in the most darkest, difficult circumstances that you think they can't possibly be redeemed from that, but they are, and they're restored, and God has the power to do that. Yeah.
Now I know that you particularly enjoyed sort of looking into Rahab and sort of kind of rummaging around. Before we look at Rahab and get too deep, there's just sort of a point of trivia I want to make.
Right. Okay.
Okay, sir. I have to say that the spies that Joshua sent into Canaan, I think, were useless. Because right at the beginning, kind of they went to Rahab's house, and right at the beginning, the fact that they're there seems to be known by the king.
Yeah, I mean, this is they did their best. I think the only
Competent.
problem is that this is a city that's on high alert, and anybody coming in would have been sort of, there's lots of informers and lots of spies going on.
They sort of came in with their collars raised and everything, and sort of people instantly said, "There's a spy. There's a spy."
Yeah, they didn't do too well at
No.
keeping that identity quiet, and probably asking a lot of very awkward questions.
Yes.
But they got rumbled back, but because God was still with them, because Rahab, she was quite clever. She kind of, basically said, well, they've already sort of gone to go after them. They're going down to the ford near the Jordan, go charging after them, and she's hidden them up under the stacks, and so they got away from that, and she sort of helps them out of the window, and all of that as part of the rescue plan for them. The interesting thing, of course, is that Joshua himself is only one of two spies, he and Caleb, who came back reporting that this land can be taken by the power of God. And so I think he selects another two. He doesn't send out 10 or 12. He sends out two, who are people of faith, and they are the people that encounter Rahab, who's a woman of faith. And so before that city falls, there is this kind of meeting together of people of faith, both those coming in and those being in that city already. So the faith community is met, and then they come. And I think that's really significant too. God is already at work, and before there's any kind of breakthrough in people's lives, even in situations nationally, God is already ahead of us. He's already at work, and he's already putting things into place.
Yeah. Now, you went on to explore Rahab's story of faith, and I thought it'd be good if we just kind of looked at the four aspects that you identified. And the first was what you called the risk of faith. What did you mean by that?
Well, just by virtue of the fact that she's taking in the spies, and she's hiding them under the stalks of flax, and she's basically sending her own people. She's sending the king's men out of the gate on a wild goose chase. She's taken this huge not gamble of faith, but this huge position of risk of faith, where she's stepping out in faith because she knows that Yahweh is going to take this city, is going to take this land. She knows and believes in God. And so she's having to step out, and her faith is causing her to take that kind of risk, if you like, to put herself on the line and actually support the efforts of the Israelites against her own people, which is a huge risk, because if she were caught, then she would be executed in the most terrible way. So that's where I was talking about the risk of faith, that sometimes, but faith in itself requires us sometimes to do things not recklessly, but just to practice something that demonstrates, is demonstrative of what we believe. So just as faith said, just as James says, that that our works effectively are an outworking, a demonstration of our faith. Faith without works is dead. What he means by that is that our faith needs to be expressed. It needs to be worked out. And sometimes in those circumstances, the extreme circumstances that Rahab was in, that was a risk.
Yeah. But it's only later, isn't it, that she kind of has the signed paper saying, you're going to be okay. We agree before God that your life's going to be spared. But she'd taken all the risk before then, hadn't she?
She'd taken all the risks beforehand, and she'd entered into a kind of covenantal agreement with the spies, that as long as she didn't tell them where they were and what they were doing, that her household would have been saved. And so that was part of it. That was part of the agreement. And of course, that in itself again is a belief of faith. The belief that if she hangs the red cord out of the window, which is symbolic of the Passover, and that then the destruction, the judgment that was going to fall on Jericho would pass over her house and pass over her household. And so she was already a person of covenant. She was already under covenant before the city even fell.
Yeah.
And interestingly, her house is actually on the city walls.
Yeah.
It's next to the city walls. So there's significance there. There's the first crack, if you like, in that spiritual fortress of the Canaanites, because God has already changed the heart of Rahab, who's opened her heart to the Israelites. And that's the first point, which is going to weaken that defense and allow Israel into the place of promise.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the risk of faith. And then the next thing was the hearing of faith. What was that about?
Yeah, I mean, Rahab had said that she had heard the stories. And if she's running a kind of inn, then it's likely to be that she would have heard lots of stories and people chatting and telling the accounts about how terrified that they were, and that their hearts are already melting at the thought of Israel encamped outside of the land of Canaan and wanting to come in, because they'd heard of how God was basically going before them and crushing their enemies, doing these miraculous deeds, releasing them from the hands of the Egyptians. I mean, that in itself, Egypt being a superpower of the region, that in itself was remarkable. Being able to live in the desert, being provided for like that, was again remarkable. Beating the Amorite kings was remarkable. And so she was already hearing these stories and already had made a decision to believe that Yahweh was the greatest of gods.
Yeah.
So by hearing, she came to faith. And of course, that's how we come to faith. We come to faith because we hear, because somebody tells us, somebody's willing to share the gospel with us. I remember when I first became a Christian, I was 14 years old. I'd had an experience of God. I'd been touched by God, and I had a kind of almost like a spiritual awakening of God. But I hadn't become a Christian until I actually sat in a room and I listened to somebody tell me the gospel, give me the gospel.
Yeah.
And the moment they told me about Jesus, I remember going up to them at the end of the night. I remember saying to them, when you told me about Jesus, it was as if the lights went on.
Right.
And that's the person that I'd encountered. And by hearing, we come into a place of faith. And Rahab had heard the stories, and that had brought her into a place of belief and a place of faith.
Yeah. I think also what's interesting is that, you know, she just heard one side of the story. She'd heard quite a, it wasn't as if it was a positive story. She just heard kind of just how terrible things were going to be because of the Israelites. But God was able to use that, wasn't he? I mean, sometimes we can think we have to be so perfect in the way we present things, but God can use just the very mention of who he is, even if it's not well presented or positively presented. God's able to use it, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I think testimony is so powerful. People want to hear our stories. And if you don't, as I say, it doesn't have to be really slick and really professional. In some ways, that can be quite off-putting for people. It just has to be really sincere.
Yeah.
It has to be heartfelt and genuine. And if you're heartfelt and genuine, and you're telling people the truth about Jesus, and you're telling people about how you've come to faith, and your testimony isn't just about what you were doing before you became a Christian, but actually it's about the power of God to change lives and transform people's lives, then that's going to have an impact, and people can come to faith by hearing that.
Yeah. So that leads us on to the third thing. So we've got the risk of faith, the hearing of faith, and then we've got the confession of faith. Why is that important?
Yeah, I think confession of faith is actually really important. I think it's something that is very significant for us spiritually. I think it helps us. I think when we confess and when we profess our faith, that reinforces that for us. But I think spiritually as well, there's something very powerful in not only deepening our faith, but also releasing our faith to others, because I think there's a release of faith. And I think spiritually, the Holy Spirit can touch people's hearts when we confess our faith and speak out our faith. I think that's really significant. And Satan wants to keep us silent. He doesn't want us to speak out and testify to the power of God and who Jesus is. So it's very, very powerful to do that. It's very important to do that we speak the truth of who Jesus is and the power he has in changing, transforming, redeeming people's lives. That testimony, that confession of faith is actually what brings about new faith. It brings about, if you like, the seeds of belief in other people.
Yeah, no, that's good, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, she does all three of those. It's a wonderful story of faith.
Yes, yeah. And then you had an interesting fourth one, which you called the patience of faith.
Yeah, because there was a point at which she knows she has an arrangement with the spies, and she believes in God. But there's going to be that moment, and the Bible tends to do this. It doesn't give you the intricate detail of how she was probably sat there with her family. Remember, she's got no children, because we're pretty certain that Rahab didn't have children, because they're not mentioned in those that needed to be spared. She lists those that need to be spared. So we're assuming she hasn't got children, but she's got her relatives. They're all sat in that room, all sat in that house. And she believes that they're going to keep their word, and that, you know, the judgment and destruction is going to pass over them. But she doesn't know that yet. She's just believing it and waiting for the moment when Israel is going to bring down the walls of Jericho, and she's going to be spared. And that waiting, that time of patience, when you're trusting in God, but you haven't seen the results yet, that's actually part of the journey of faith. That's a challenging time, and we call it the patience of faith, because actually it's an expression of faith. Your expression of faith can be by what you say, but your expression of faith can also be waiting on God too.
Yeah. So do you think kind of her bit of the wall just sort of stayed up there?
Her bit of the wall, yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's one of the last bits of the wall. But I've got my own opinion about Jericho's walls. Actually, I personally think that it's not the phonic sound of the trumpets that brought the walls down. It wasn't. We're not looking at a scientific, physical impact of that on the walls. It's a miracle of God. You're not going to find the walls basically because God turned it to dust. So the walls are literally miraculously destroyed by God.
Yeah.
That this is a supernatural, miraculous event that takes place at Jericho, where the walls are literally rendered as, I believe, are rendered as dust, and that's what literally they just collapse simultaneously. The whole thing just falls. It must have been a most powerful, overwhelming demonstration of the power of God against the Canaanite armies. Yeah. But it was the first and the only one that happens like that. After that, it starts to get harder for Israel, and they have to start trusting in God that he's given them every place they set their feet, but they're going to have to fight for it. He's not going to bring the walls down and turn them to dust each and every time. They're going to have to fight for it.
Yeah.
Apart from Rahab's house.
Yes. Yeah.
Just standing there. And everyone's looking at Rahab's house thinking, suspicious. That's it.
Yes. I think I still find it amazing why so much, if you like, kind of, let's kind of use an old-fashioned sort of print word, like column inches are devoted to the story of Rahab. Because it's not really, tactically, it doesn't really help them, because God's going to do his thing anyway. She doesn't appear afterwards. It just seems somehow that God saw it as something very important, because really I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it's almost like an insignificant part of the story. It doesn't really help the story go along, does it? It's not like the 12 spies who went into Canaan, and as a result of that, you get massive consequences. So that should be in the record. But it seems as if God is wanting to say something very, very deep, because actually, in terms of the story, the big story, it's not very significant, is it? The big story of, if you like, the Israelites coming into Canaan, but in terms of the bigger story of God, it is significant.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's massively significant in that bigger sense. On one level, it looks as if it isn't, but actually, it's clear because the spies report back to say, the people are melting with fear. What they're saying is, God has already gone ahead and has already basically defeated this people. They're already defeated, and that's really what the spies need to come back and say, that God's already there. And he's got people, even people in the wall, even people in the city, who are on the side of Yahweh. And therefore, when Israel goes in, they know that the spiritual conflict, quite aside from the physical conflict, the spiritual conflict is already won. And therefore, that's going to be demonstrative with the taking of Jericho, because it wasn't just about taking a city, it was about the, if you like, the destruction and defeat, if you like, of the spiritual powers that were over that country. And so you have this overwhelming kind of power of God. This land belongs to the people of Israel, and we're going to demonstrate that. I'm going to demonstrate that by going ahead of my people, and I'm going to flatten their defenses and allow Israel to come in. And the interesting thing, I do make a sort of reference back to Matthew's gospel, where Jesus meets the Canaanite woman, the Syrophoenician woman. It's the only time in the whole of the gospels where Jesus steps outside the Holy Land, and he's now in Syrophoenicia. Syrophoenicia, by the way, was an interesting place. It was Greek speaking and had Syrian influence, and in fact was quite hostile to the Galileans. And on several occasions, when Galilee had gone into famine, Syrophoenicia, which is quite a wealthy trading state, did not offer any help at all to the Galileans. And so there's this discussion that happens between the Syrophoenician woman and Jesus about bread being tossed to the dogs as you might, and there's quite a lot of historical overlay there. But the interesting thing is that the lady who needs her daughter to be healed is a lady of faith, and she believes in Jesus, and she knows that Jesus is Messiah. She knows that he has the power to heal and restore her, to restore her household, restore her family. And you see, that incident that happens in the New Testament is evidence that everything that happens in the Old Testament lives in the foreshadow of what's going on with Jesus. And of course, the Syrophoenician woman is living as a Canaanite woman who were regarded as the most cursed of amongst peoples by the Jews. She's living as a Canaanite woman in, if you like, in the faith heritage of Rahab. That there are still people within the Canaanite peoples who believed in God and the power of Yahweh. Yeah.
So if we had to sum up and sort of say what this shows us about God, what would you say?
I think it's a wonderful story and shows us that it doesn't matter how far away we get from God, it doesn't matter how deep people are in terms of the situations they're in, the darkness they can be in, God can still reach in and he can still rescue them, redeem their lives. And the other thing that I think is really precious about this story is it shows us that God has a plan and a purpose for our lives. And he has a plan and purpose for Rahab's life. And who would have thought that that's actually what's going to happen to this woman? And she's been rescued from the dire straits that she was in to be actually somebody really significant in salvation history. Yeah.
Good. And I know it sounds a bit trite if I say this, but it does honestly give hope to all of us, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. God can do not only rescue Rahab and transform her life and turn her life around, well, he can do that for all of us, and he will do that for us. Yeah.
Good. Well, that's a lovely point to end on, isn't it, Rob?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great story. Do recommend people read Joshua 2, yeah. and meditate on that, and just allow God to speak to them on that and give them a sense of his purpose and plan for their lives. Yeah.
Good. Well, lovely to catch up with you, and hopefully we can do the same thing this time next week.
Bless you. Yeah, we will do so. We'll do so.
They were returned, weren't they, next week?
So yes, I'll be asking the questions, tricky questions.
I was nice to you this week. I was just lobbing you some nice, gentle balls for you to whack for 6 or whatever.
Yeah, you were very kind and gentle. Yeah, thank you. Bless you then, Dave. Thank you. Take care. Okay, bye for now.